Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm gonna be testing a GeForce GTX 1080 Ti in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. This one is the Gigabyte Triple Fan edition of the card. We are running it with the latest NVIDIA drivers, and I'm not manually overclocking it. You can see all of its specs right here in Tech Power-Up's GPU Z, released back in 2017, and it's still a beast, a little bit. And it has 11 gigabytes of GDDR5X memory, and over on the left, we're pairing it with the i5-13600K overclocked to 5.5 GHz and 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 MHz RAM in dual channel. Let's get into it, shall we? Let's go over the settings first. I'm starting at 1080p resolution, and we're also going to test this one at 1440p and 4K. We're getting 69 FPS, actually. Very interesting and very nice. I'm also going to use some FSR3 a little bit later in this video, but I'm going to turn it off right now. It's still applying the sharpening, so it looks a little bit sharper with this than TAA, so I'll leave it like that. And you can also see that frame generation is grayed out over here. I can't select it, but there is a trick that you can do. You can enable it in the config files, so I'll also test it out with some frame generation. Over on the graphics settings, we're using the high settings preset without motion blur. Everything else is still the same. Let's do this. And here we have it, my friends, 1080p native resolution on a GTX 1080 Ti and on high settings at the same time. Seems like the 1080 Ti is still not there yet, obviously. Like, this is a very strong GPU. For the latest games, it struggles quite a bit. I mean, it's not really getting 60 frames per second, but neither did, like, the 3060. Still, this is a little bit slower than the RTX 3060 12GB in this particular title. There are a lot of games where the 1080 Ti actually surpasses the 3060 quite a bit in performance, especially DirectX 11 titles, but this is the X12. It's latest graphics and technology, you know, and it's extremely beautiful and extremely intensive at the same time. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of stuttering, as you can see by the frame time graph. Sometimes it goes crazy like that, and if you move the camera around like this, you can see it also has its ups and downs, you know, on the frame time. But if you lock the FPS to... Oh, come on, where's the animation? Oh, he was starting to do the animation, but I stopped it, I think. I remember Far Cry 3 had some diving animations. Why doesn't this? Again, I probably just cancelled it. But as I was saying, as I showed with the GTX 1060, if you lock the FPS to a value that's lower than the minimums, and the minimums here were about 31, the 1% lows are accurate, it will be a stable and smooth experience with a flat frame time graph all of the time, which is definitely what you want. So if you lock it to 30 FPS, you can expect a flawless 30 FPS experience. Let's enable some upscaling here in the form of FSR3. I am gonna set it to fixed and quality mode, which is just the default quality FSR3. There's also biased mode right here. You can see what it does at the right, but I'm not gonna utilize it here. So let's apply that. And now, oh boy, okay, so we're getting 60s. I think this is closer to what the RTX 3060 got at 1080p with DLSS quality instead of FSR3 quality. And DLSS does look a little bit better than FSR3 in this game. At higher resolutions, it's kind of hard to tell them apart, actually. The FSR3 implementation is pretty good, but at least at 1080p, you can see quite a bit of noise, especially on the water right there. Flickering clouds, but that also happens at native resolution if you're running at lower settings. Not sure about high settings, because I never noticed the flickering on high settings, but maybe it also happens. Look at the textures as well. 11 gigabytes of VRAM should be enough for everything here. They still look amazing, and that's nice to see, of course. A little bit less stuttering this time around, since we're closer to 60 frames per second sometimes. But in intensive areas like this one, you can still see it drop into like the 50s and 40s. So yeah, this is a good result for the 1080 Ti, as you can see over here, as we're far away from that camp area, which is very intensive. We're actually hitting like 70s. That's really, really impressive, actually. Granted, this is running at 720p internally because of FSR3 and upscaling it to 1080p, but it looks nowhere near 720p. Let's move on to frame generation, and for that, I'll first set this to ultra quality right here. This is much more intensive than quality. And you can tell right away, like it's dropping into the mid 40s right here. But with frame generation enabled at the same time, it should look okay and it should perform really well. Alright, so here is the graphics settings.cfg file inside of your documents folder, my games and AFOP. You open that with whatever you want. I'm going to open it with Notepad and scroll down to the bottom and you can see the frame generation is set to false. Just type true over there instead of false, save that, and go back to the game, and it will work. And here we are again. 1080p, FSR3 Ultra Quality Fixed is enabled, and now frame generation is turned on. Oh my goodness, whoa, okay. So that is literally double of what we were seeing, isn't it? That is amazing, and of what we were seeing on Ultra Quality FSR3. Wow. And now it's not really stuttering as much, like that frame time graph isn't going all over the place when I do this. It's a little bit more stable, you know. I can't feel any stuttering whatsoever. I'm going to start counting the FPS as well. Input lag-wise, since it is above like 80 frames per second most of the time at least, it's not bad whatsoever, especially for a single-player title. If it was a multiplayer shooter, I wouldn't really recommend you to enable FG because of the input lag that comes with it. But here, I can barely notice anything, honestly, guys. It feels really good. 1080 Ti is doing an awesome job with frame generation enabled, and it doesn't look bad whatsoever. I mean, the water still looks bad, obviously, because that looked bad even at native resolution, right? Not as bad, but yeah, the water is very weak in this game, and there are some artifacts, especially around the iron sights of this weapon, you can see. Other than that, and a little bit of pixelation here and there when you're moving, and halo and stuff, which was still present at quality FSR and 1080p, it is looking really good, and it's not even dropping from 70 frames per second, even here in this area, guys. So it's safe to say that this is probably the way to go with the 1080 Ti if you're playing at 1080p. This is really good. Alright, now I'm curious about 1440p resolution, guys. Frame generation is still enabled on ultra quality and we're still using the high settings. Obviously at native resolution it's a very bad idea to play like this because it will drop from 30 FPS. I will still test it out a little bit later, but I thought of trying it out first with frame generation, and look at this. It's still getting 60 frames per second. And you know what? You can definitely notice a ton of input lag this time around. As I told you, if the FPS drop from like 70 frames, it starts being really noticeable, and it will definitely affect your aim if you're trying to shoot at things and enemies fast and stuff like that on like missions. Sometimes you need to be a little bit quicker in terms of aiming and stuff like that. It's not going to require competitive levels of aiming, but yeah, it will hurt your overall experience, that's for sure. And that's a bit of a shame, you know. I really hope that they manage to fix the input lag issues, both AMD and NVIDIA, because frame generation from NVIDIA also has some input lag issues, of course. But if they actually manage to fix that in the future, we have a really great technology here on our fingertips, my friends. It is awesome. And here, it's down into the 50s. Which, again, if you're just watching this on YouTube, you might feel like this is amazing performance, and it kind of is for a 1080 Ti to be delivering these graphics with this performance in 2023, almost 7 years after it has released, you know. But again, if you're actually playing the game, when you drop from 60 FPS, the input lag is just insane, guys. Again, if it does drop from 70 FPS, I can't really recommend it. Or at least 60 FPS, right? Because at 60, I could still handle it. But now in the 50s, definitely not. Let's drop it down to quality here, still with frame generation, all right? And now we're seeing up to 80 frames per second near the water here. Okay, it looks a little bit worse, but not terrible. My God, what the hell? What are you doing here? Jesus. And it gets 60 FPS in intensive areas like this one. So it is not as bad. Once again, they're just destroying all of this. What happened? But yeah, like over here, it feels really good. When you come across those little settlements, it's gonna drop into the low 60s and it's not gonna feel as good. But it's still playable. It's definitely a heck of a lot better than dropping into the 50s, that's for sure. I'm gonna go ahead, disable frame generation, try it out with just FSR quality as well as native res, and then we'll move on to 4K, which is gonna be terrible. Here we go, 2560 by 1440, FSR3 is set to quality and fixed, and frame generation is turned off, and here we're using exactly the same high settings. So I guess if you don't like frame generation, 1440p is still gonna be doable, but with some big drops in intensive areas into the 30s. Now 30 is not terrible, it's actually getting very similar FPS to what we saw at 1080p native, probably a little bit better actually. Didn't it drop to like the low 30s previously? I think so, right? Yeah, but hey, it's rough. It becomes pretty rough in these areas. Still, for a single-player title, especially if you enable some motion blur, for example, it's probably gonna be very decent of an experience still, because most of the time you'll be hovering around 40 to 50 frames per second, even more than 50 sometimes, as you can see right here. So it's not the end of the world. You can still play at 1440p with quality FSR. This is still looking amazing and sharp and detailed. You can see a bit of noise, especially again around the iron sights of the weapon when I'm doing this, like just panning the camera around. There's a lot of noise there, but that's just minor in my opinion. If you have like a 27-inch 1440p monitor, it's gonna look really, really awesome, and it's gonna run all right. You know, not a lot of stuttering, although the frame time's a little bit worse than it was with frame generation. But I mean, at least you don't have the huge input lag from frame generation. So if you don't like that, this is still a reasonable way to experience the game for sure. Now let's disable FSR, and this is where things are gonna go to hell. Yes, exactly. So at native resolution, this is not happening with the GTX 1080 Ti at 1440p. Okay, as expected. I think nobody expected this card to do 30 plus FPS in this intensive of a game at 1440p these days, 7 years later, you know. Still good that you can like walk around and stuff, but why would you with 20 FPS when you can get very similar visuals and way higher performance if you just use some quality FSR or frame generation? Okay, so what about 4K resolution? For that, I think we should probably set it to fixed here, no VSync, and set it to performance FSR right away, especially at high settings, right? So let's go up to 3840 by 2160. And it's still hanging in there, 30s, okay, all right, Jax, are you serious? You went around. Oh my god, what are you doing? Why? Oh, okay. Well, I'm gonna go away. Back to camp, my friends, because it's probably gonna drop into the 20s there. But this is a little bit better than what I expected. And FSR3 at 4K, even on performance, looks acceptable. I can still see quite a bit of noise and stuff like that in a lot of the things. But there is a ton of detail that is still preserved at what is essentially 1080p upscaled to 4K. FSR3 is a really nice implementation here in this game, actually. All right, okay, yeah, there we go. It starts dropping from 30 FPS. Frame time goes all over the place. Not ideal, right? I'm gonna stop it there. You shouldn't really do this. Although it's impressive, it's not an experience that I would be comfortable with. Now let's try it with the same settings, same FSR performance, but with frame generation enabled, all right? And, ooh. Okay, that feels a heck of a lot smoother, but again, it's the same input lag issue. I would still take this over drops into the 20s, you know, so if you must play at 4K, I guess it's gonna be okay, especially if you lock it to like, ooh, that was a massive bug. Especially if you lock it to 50 frames per second with input lag of 25 or 30, close to that. That could be possible and playable a little bit, but I'll just recommend you to drop your resolution at this point, guys, okay? Because at 1440p you can achieve a way better experience. Even on a 4K monitor, it will still look okay. Yes, a little bit blurrier, obviously, but I mean, with drops into the 50s and even high 40s at times, I cannot recommend this with frame generation enabled. So we should move on to the medium settings preset this time. I'm still gonna disable motion blur, apply that. I'll disable frame generation as well as restart the game to fully apply everything and go back to 1080p. Here we go. After a fresh restart, 1080p resolution, no frame generation, no scaling quality, it's turned off at the moment, and the medium settings preset with no motion blur. Okay, right away we're seeing 50 frames per second, back here getting 40s, that's much better than high settings. The game still looks really good, of course. See that tree right now, guys? That is awful. Obviously, it's not really that big of a deal, it's only that tree that looks awful at the moment. Everything else still looks alright, pretty detailed. Well, aside from that cliff over there, the textures are also very crappy there. But yeah, most of the things still look alright. But again, although I haven't really come across any shadow popping issues, or at least any huge ones, it will happen. Anyway, let's use quality FSR 3 now, and there we go. A good bump up in performance, 70s, 60s. So now, most of the time, it's definitely going to be 60 plus FPS, okay? But of course, we got to check it out near the camp area where it's going to drop the most. Drops into like the mid 50s around here. That's not too bad, actually. I would consider this experience still. In terms of smoothness and performance, it's all right. Mostly above 60 FPS with a few drops in more intensive areas is not really that big of an issue in my opinion, guys. And obviously, if you enable frame generation, I'm gonna set it to ultra quality here. This is it, guys. 1080p, frame generation on, ultra quality FSR. Once again, it's looking a little bit sharper than quality FSR with 1080p resolution, but it's also a little bit more noisy in some areas. But I think I prefer this look, because the noise was still there at quality FSR. Look at this, dropping down into the high 80s. High 80s pretty good, guys. No stuttering issues either. Input lag is very acceptable, almost non-existent, especially at 100 plus frames per second. You can't really feel any major input lag whatsoever. And yeah, I would definitely enjoy the experience like this. Again, if it wasn't for the pop-in issues that I really hate in this game, this would have... Oh, there we go. Did you see that one? I wasn't even looking at there and I saw it popping in. The fact that this is getting 1080p 100 FPS with really nice visuals makes me want to believe that with frame generation, especially with better implementations of frame generation in a few years' time, 1080 Ti won't die. But at the same time, it's getting pretty old, you know? And it will probably stop receiving driver support in a couple of years. Also, I'm still very impressed that the 900 series is still having a driver support, because that released back in 2014. It's been 9 years at this point. I think that's the longest supported architecture so far. Very impressive with frame generation here in medium settings. I like that. Let's go up to 1440. Here we go, 2560 by 1440. Still using the same settings here. Frame generation with ultra quality FSR and medium settings. And okay, so previously we were seeing around 60 FPS. Still dropping into the 60s here at 1080p with ultra quality FSR and high settings. But now, look at that. It is actually not even dropping from 60 FPS, although the 1% lows are low because of the little fluctuations in the frame time graph. But yeah, this is not bad. Again, input lag is going to be around the same as 30 to 40 frames per second, but you'll be getting like 60 to 70, and once it's 70 plus, it actually feels alright, you know? So only in worst case scenarios, you're going to feel a little bit of input lag. You know what? I'll take it. If you want this experience, go ahead. It feels great. It looks great. It's just going to have to deal with the pop-in, but that's not the end of the world, really. I guess you can expect some compromises already with the GTX 1080 Ti. When this card released, it was a complete beast, of course. You could actually play a ton of games, even at 4K resolution. I remember seeing it. It was kind of overkill, like the 4090 was when it released as well. 4090 isn't really as overkill, but this stood overkill for a long period of time, longer than the 4090, because the games back then didn't really get that much more intensive over time, you know. Alright, 1440p frame generation is off, and I will set this to quality. Oh, 1080 Ti. It's not enough for 60 FPS. To be expected, I guess, since we were dropping into the 60s with frame generation enabled, right? But yeah, again, for those of you who prefer the non-input laggy experience... Oh, whoa, 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 whoa! That's a big scream, Jesus Christ! Well, this is for those of you who don't like frame generation. All right, it's okay. Frame time graph is a little bit more all over the place. I think FG now on the AMD side of things also smooths out these stuttering issues by quite a bit, which is very good to see because NVIDIA's frame generation also did that, but AMD's didn't really do that back when I tested it in Force Broken. But now in Avatar, it's a good implementation and it's working really, really well. Anyway, over here, dropping into the 50s. All right, yeah, this is rough, guys. But again, you gotta remember that medium settings in this game still have a freaking ton of detail. It's not like medium settings in other titles. You could call these high settings, and everyone would believe that, right? So there's that. Still getting 60 FPS at times, even. So that's pretty impressive. And again, at 2 GHz plus 1080 Ti, for example, like a Gaming X, Asus ROG Strix, and so on, those would definitely get up to 60 FPS on average. The last thing to do, I think, is maybe native resolution, right? At 1440p. Here we go. Gets 30s. It's probably gonna dip down into the 20s. Yeah, there we go, 29. And there will probably be a couple of areas that are more intensive than this one as well, so... No, definitely don't use native resolution at 1440 or 4K, no matter what you do. So let's go up to 4K now, enable FSR performance, medium settings, let's see. It still looks really pretty. What the hell is happening there? Wait a second. Oh, he just landed there. Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, so it's getting 30 plus. So if you want that native 4K resolution, that's not gonna happen. But if you want that native without frame generation, you know, native frames, you could say, you can have it here with 30 plus FPS. Lock it to 30, I guess that's the best course of action, and it will be smooth and playable on medium settings, still looking really, really pretty and detailed, a little bit noisy sometimes, and it has those, well, no, it doesn't have those artifacts because it's not frame generation. Let's enable FG and call it a day. And speaking of FG, I just restarted and it's now turned on. Performance, FSR still, medium settings, and here we go, getting 60s. Alright, and 50s, obviously. It's not gonna be 60 plus all of the time. I'm not sure if this is a better experience than what we just saw. Maybe it is, in terms of smoothness. Especially, what? What is especially, Chris? What the... Okay, I've been talking for way too long. Especially if you play with a controller, for example, it's gonna be fine with frame generation. Alright, sit a little bit further away from the monitor so you can't really see the imperfections and the little artifacts that come with it, on like the sights and so on, the iron sights. It's gonna be okay. 50 plus FPS is what you should expect even in intensive areas, so... Alright, I'll take it. But the thing is, the input lag, since it's below 60, is quite rough. But hey, that's been it for the GTX 1080 Ti. Pop-in issues again. In Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. Thank you very much for watching this video. It's probably a very big one, but hey, hopefully it was informative. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one very soon. Love you all. Bye-bye.